For years, we thought we knew exactly where the Australian cattle dog came from. But new analysis of ancient DNA has just blown that story wide open. It turns out, the origins of this breed weren't found in a simple kennel or a traditional breeding program. They were hidden in a place nobody expected. And what researchers are uncovering now changes everything we thought we knew about how this dog was actually engineered. In 1830, George Hall made a choice that changed everything. He did not wait for a perfect dog to appear on its own. He started crossing imported collies with domesticated dingoes, trying to build a herding dog that could actually survive the interior. That detail matters, because it turns the origin from a vague legend into a deliberate experiment. As documented by A.J. Burt Howard in Hall's Healer, Origins of the Cattle Dog in Australia, 2000, this was not random mixing. It was a targeted engineering of functionality. It was a practical attempt to solve a very specific failure. The dogs Europeans brought with them could work in gentler places, but they struggled when the heat rose, the distance widened, and the cattle refused to cooperate. So the first real solution was not a breed name. It was a decision born in pressure. Hall looked at the landscape and understood that imported blood alone would not be enough. The collie contributed herding instinct, but the dingo brought something else, a toughness shaped by the land itself, a body and mind already accustomed to scarcity, silence, and survival. That blend gave the developing dog a foundation that was different from anything stockmen had relied on before. It also explains why the early line felt so unsettling to later observers. This was not a polished kennel project. It was a working answer to a daily struggle. Once you see that, the next question becomes sharper. If Hall was already using dingoes in 1830, what exactly did breeders think they were creating? A farm helper? A heat-proof drover? A new kind of animal entirely? The answer was still incomplete, and that uncertainty became part of the breed's story. Each generation could keep what worked and discard what failed, but the target kept shifting as the demands of the cattle stations shifted too. The dog had to move with sheep? No, it had to bite, turn, drive, and endure for hours without breaking down. That is a far harsher test than obedience alone. Look at the logic underneath it. A collie could read a handler. A dingo could survive rough country. But neither trait by itself solved the full problem. The early breeders were trying to fuse trust and independence into one animal, and that tension never fully disappeared. It is why the developing dog was admired not just for intelligence, but for the way it could think while working, make decisions in motion, and keep going when another breed might shut down. The body was compact, the coat short, the energy relentless, yet none of those details were decorative. They were evidence. And this is where the story turns from simple origin into something more unsettling. A breed that begins as a practical answer can still hide unknown layers inside it. Hall's experiment opened the door, but it did not close the case. It only proved that people were willing to build a dog from whatever the land seemed to demand. The deeper truth, then, is not just that a new working animal was needed. It is that the first solution already carried the seeds of a much stranger history, one that would force later generations to rethink where this dog really came from. When George Hall died in 1870, the story should have gone quiet. Instead, the kennel kept moving. Thomas Hall, his son, carried the work forward and sharpened what his father had begun, pushing the line of herding dogs into something steadier, tougher, and more useful than the rough first attempts ever were. That detail changes everything, because it means the animal on the paddock was never the product of one lucky crossing. It was being revised in real time, one choice after another, as if the country itself were editing the breed. Think about what that says. A dead end would have left behind a curiosity, maybe even a local legend, but a continuing breeding program leaves a record of intention. Thomas Hall did not simply preserve a memory. He improved a working animal under pressure, keeping the useful traits and stripping away what failed in the heat, dust, and distance of the Australian run. The result was a line that grew more reliable with each generation, not by chance, but by a kind of practical discipline that farmers understood better than anyone else. They needed a dog that could gather stubborn stock, hold focus through exhaustion, and recover faster than the work could wear it down. That is where the breed begins to look less like a finished invention and more like a living argument. Every generation answered the one before it. If a dog hesitated, the hesitation vanished. If it broke down under pressure, it disappeared from the line. If it could track, grip, turn, and keep moving with clipped efficiency, it stayed. The body became compact for a reason. The coat stayed short for a reason. Even the hard stare and the habit of making decisions without waiting for a command began to read like evidence of selection, not personality alone. What people admired as toughness was also memory made visible. Pet Health Network notes that after 1870, the Hall breeding work continued through Thomas Hall, and that continuation matters more than a simple family detail. It shows how a practical need turned into a multi-generational project, with each step tightening the fit between dog and country. The deeper we look, the more this breed stops resembling a single origin story and starts resembling a chain of solved problems. And yet one question still hangs in the air. If the line was being refined so carefully, what exactly was buried inside it that later DNA would have to uncover? By the time the Bagust brothers stepped in around 1890, the story was no longer about simply making a tough dog. It had become a matter of control, balance, and purpose. The earlier generations had already proven that the old imported herders were too fragile for the Australian interior, but now the breed was being pushed into a new shape, one that had to work beside horses without panic and move with a quicker, cleaner rhythm across rough country. What the Bagusts did matters because it breaks the illusion of a single, tidy beginning. Historical analysis, including research by author Guy Hull in The Dogs That Made Australia, suggests this standardization remains controversial. While often attributed to the Bagust brothers' infusion of Dalmatian and Kelpie blood, that choice was not decorative. It was practical. Dalmata influence helped fit the dog into a life around horses, while Kelpie added a sharper working edge, more agility, more motion, more responsiveness in the field. In other words, the breed was not frozen into existence once the first cross succeeded. It was revised, and that revision changes everything. A dog that had already been shaped by rough land and hard labor was now being refined by another generation of human decisions, each one solving a different problem. The result was not a simple lineage, but a layered one, built from inherited usefulness, and then deliberately adjusted when the job demanded more. That is why the Australian cattle dog cannot be understood as a clean recipe from one moment in time. It is a record of repeated edits, each one leaving a trace in the body, the gait, and the instinct. Look closely enough, and the breed begins to feel less like a finished answer and more like a living compromise. It had to be strong enough for cattle, calm enough near horses, nimble enough to turn fast, and resilient enough to keep going when the day stretched on far past comfort. The short coat, the compact frame, the intense focus, even the suspicion that so often shows in its eyes, all of it now reads as the outcome of different pressures meeting in the same animal. That is what makes the Bagust chapter so unsettling. It proves the origin was never sealed off after the first successful working dog appeared. The breed was still being tuned, still being negotiated, still absorbing traits that made it more adaptable to the realities of the outback. And once that becomes clear, the next question is unavoidable. How many other hidden layers were already waiting inside the dog before anyone thought the story was settled? What the body gives away is harder to fake than any old tale. Look at an Australian cattle dog, and the first thing you notice is not beauty for its own sake, but design. The coat lies close and short, dense enough to shrug off weather, light enough not to trap heat. The frame is compact, built for sudden bursts and long hours rather than showy size. According to the breed standard formalized by Robert Koleski in 1903, the first to codify the specific intelligence and stamina of the breed, these traits were never decorative. Those traits do not sit there by accident. They read like a tool shaped until every unnecessary edge was stripped away. That is why the blue heeler feels so unusual when you watch one at rest. It does not look idle. It looks paused. Even stillness carries purpose. The eyes stay busy. The posture stays ready. Selective obedience, in this case, is not stubbornness in the ordinary sense. It is judgment. The dog does not simply receive a command and collapse into passivity. It weighs, reacts, and decides with a kind of working independence that cattle country demanded long before anyone wrote a neat description of the breed. In the heat and dust of the Australian interior, that difference mattered more than elegance ever could. And once you understand that, the coat changes meaning too. Short and dense is not only a visual detail, it suggests a life where burrs, thorns, sun, and distance all had to be negotiated by the body itself. A heavy coat would have become a burden. A delicate one would have failed at the first hard day. What survived instead was a dog able to move through punishing ground with economy, not waste. The shape of the chest, the tightness of the body, the refusal to overexpose itself to the environment, all of it speaks to a selection process that rewarded function over ornament. That is the quiet revelation hidden in plain sight. The Australian cattle dog was never meant to look finished in a decorative sense. It was meant to look capable. Every line in its body points back to labor, but not labor in the simplistic sense of obedience alone. This dog had to think while moving, listen without becoming dependent, and keep working when the day turned harsh and people grew tired. That balance between independence and control is what makes the breed so compelling now. It is not merely a worker, it is a working mind housed inside a body built to endure. Seen this way, the ancient DNA story becomes even more unsettling because the genetics did not just explain ancestry. They explained why this form was worth preserving. The surprise was never only where the lineage came from. It was that the body itself carried the answer before the documents did. A dense coat, lasting stamina, sharp intelligence, and that selective kind of obedience all point to the same hard truth. This dog was crafted to solve a problem that ordinary dogs could not survive. And if the body could be read that clearly, then there is still one question left open. What else, inside the animal, was quietly inherited before the history books caught up? The nickname finally gives the method away. Long before the Australian cattle dog was admired for its stamina or its sharp instincts, people on the ground knew it by what it did in motion. Blue heeler or red heeler, depending on the color carried in its coat. Those names were not ornaments. They were field language, stamped out by work. And work, in this case, meant moving cattle by driving at the heels, a quick bite to the back of the herd that sent heavy animals forward without wasting a step. That small detail changes everything. It means the popular name of the animal was never separate from its purpose. The color described what the eye saw first, but the heeler part described the behavior that mattered most. In the rough yards and open country of Australia, a dog that charged head-on would be trampled. A dog that hung back would fail, so the method had to be precise, close enough to interrupt, fast enough to escape, and disciplined enough to repeat the pattern mile after mile. The nickname became a practical summary of an entire system. Viewed that way, the animal's reputation stops being vague and becomes almost mechanical. The blue-coated worker and the red-coated worker were not two different inventions. They were variations of the same survival tool, shaped by visibility, terrain, and the demands of cattle that did not forgive hesitation. Even the name carries a lesson. It tells us that the people who depended on this animal were not impressed by beauty first. They were reading function first, then color, then temperament, then endurance. In the hierarchy of usefulness, the heel came before the legend. And this is where the older mystery sharpens instead of fades. If the nickname preserves the method so clearly, then the method itself must have been powerful enough to define the breed in public memory. That means the animal was not only bred to endure distance and heat, it was bred to solve the single most dangerous part of cattle work, getting close without losing control. The whole identity of the Australian cattle dog, as preserved in blue heeler and red heeler, is a reminder that some names do more than describe. They reveal the exact pressure that created them. Once you hear it this way, the history feels more human too. You can almost see the stockman watching a hard day unfold, noticing which worker stayed light on its feet, which one corrected a wandering beast with one sharp move, and which one came back ready to do it again. The nickname was born in that kind of observation, from people who had no patience for theory when a herd was breaking apart in front of them. They needed proof in the dust, not on paper. And the animal gave them that proof every time it moved in at the heels and turned chaos into direction. Then the story takes a turn that feels almost impossible at first. The same Australian cattle dog built for dust, distance, and hard stock work has also been used successfully as a guide and assistance dog for people with disabilities. The detail matters, because it breaks the comfortable image of a single-purpose worker. According to the public entry at in.wikipedia.org, wiki, Australian cattle dog, the breed can serve in that role, but only with substantial physical and mental stimulation. In other words, the very traits that made it a machine for the paddock also make it demanding in a human home. That tension is the clue. A dog that can read pressure, movement, and hesitation on an open range can sometimes read a sidewalk, a doorway, or a crowded room with the same sharp attention. What changes is not the engine, but the setting. A stockman once needed a partner that would stay alert under brutal sun and still think through chaos. A person living with a disability needs something different on the surface, but just as exact beneath it: steadiness, responsiveness, and a mind that does not drift. The Australian cattle dog carries that contradiction without apology. It is intense enough to wear out the unprepared, and focused enough to become life-changing when trained with purpose. That makes its second life more surprising than its first. People usually talk about working breeds as if work ends where the pasture ends. But this one keeps extending the idea of usefulness into places where most herding dogs would be out of place. The same determination that once pushed cattle forward can, in the right hands, become support, guidance, and daily balance. The animal is not softened into something else. It is redirected, and that redirection says as much about human need as it does about breeding. There is something moving in that shift. A breed shaped by necessity for the outback ends up helping someone move through a world built for barriers rather than herds. The old labor is still there in the bones of its behavior, but now it serves a quieter kind of survival. A crossing of history and training turns a forceful worker into a companion with a public role that few people expect. That is why the Australian cattle dog refuses to stay inside one definition. It was born from pressure, refined by discipline, and then discovered to have a reach wider than the place that created it. If you look closely, that is where the deeper meaning appears. The breed was never only about cattle, heat, or endurance. It became a test of whether relentless focus could be trusted in another human life. And once that question is answered in practice, the old image changes shape. What looked like a narrow working animal becomes a reminder that usefulness can travel farther than origin, and that the strongest instincts are sometimes the ones that can be taught a new direction without losing their force. Sources used on the public record keep returning to the same quiet fact. This is a breed that asks for work, attention, and movement, yet can still stand beside a person who needs help getting through the day. That is not a contradiction to be dismissed. It is the point. The same fire that once made sense in a harsh country can, under careful training, become a form of trust. And when that happens, the Australian cattle dog stops being just a symbol of survival in the bush and becomes something rarer, a working mind that can cross from herd to human life without losing what made it extraordinary in the first place. Long before any registry gave it a place on paper, the dog had already earned its reputation in dust, heat, and hard miles. That is the part history often hides. A working breed can exist in full force while official recognition lags far behind, as if institutions need time to catch up with reality. In the case of the Australian cattle dog, the delay says almost as much as the approval. By the time the Australian Kennel Club finally recognized the breed in 1980, generations of cattle work had already shaped its body, its habits, and the way people understood its value. That date matters because it exposes a strange order of things. The dog was not waiting for a certificate to become itself. It had already been tested in stockyards, on open runs, and along brutal routes where hesitation could cost a day's work or a whole herd's control. Formal recognition came late, and that lateness is not a footnote. It is evidence that the breed's identity was secured through use, not ceremony. The papers arrived after the proving ground had spoken, and once you see it that way, the 1980 recognition starts to feel less like a beginning and more like a public admission. The Australian Kennel Club was acknowledging a creature that rural Australia had been living with for decades, compact, alert, physically spare, and able to keep moving when softer dogs would have broken down. By then, the type was already clear enough that the registry could only record what work had long made visible. That is why the official stamp carries such a quiet shock. It confirms the breed, but it also reveals how long recognition can trail behind necessity. There is another layer here, and it is easy to miss. A breed recognized so late has usually been judged first by utility and only later by appearance. That means every visible trait carried a practical verdict before it became a line in a standard. The short coat, the endurance, the dense frame, the alert expression, the instinct to keep pressure on moving cattle without wasting motion, none of that waited for approval. It had already been selected by the country itself, by climate, distance, and the daily demand to solve problems quickly. So the 1980 milestone does more than close a registry gap. It marks the moment when a national working solution became officially legible as a breed. But the deeper truth is still outside the frame of the certificate. The dog had already crossed the threshold from experiment to institution, long before anyone wrote its name into a kennel record. That gap between what is lived and what is acknowledged is exactly why this story feels larger than one breed. It is about how human systems often arrive late to what labor and survival have already settled, and that leaves one final question hanging in the air. If recognition came so late, what else about this dog was understood by farmers, handlers, and stockmen long before science, clubs, and formal language chose to explain it? The answer is not in the paper. It is in the life that paper only dared to catch up with. What survives in the Australian cattle dog is not a pretty accident. It is a body that stayed compact, a coat that stayed short and dense, a mind that learned to think while moving, and a will that never turned soft under pressure. Viovet's breed profile points to the traits people still notice first: endurance, intelligence, selective obedience, and that tight, weather-resistant coat. But once you place those traits back into the Australian interior, they stop looking like a list and start looking like a verdict. This is the part of the story that changes everything. The dog was never shaped to impress a city, a show ring, or a polite idea of perfection. It was shaped to last through heat, distance, dust, and cattle that did not care about sentiment. In that world, selective obedience is not defiance. It is judgment. It is the ability to hear a command, weigh the field, and act with enough independence to keep the herd moving when human hands are too far away to manage every step. That is why the breed feels so singular. Its intelligence was never decorative. It was practical, immediate, and expensive to build. To look closely at the physical result, and the logic becomes harder to ignore. A short, dense coat sheds punishment instead of collecting it. Endurance turns a dog from a helper into a reliable presence across long days. Strength matters, but so does the ability to conserve it. The Australian cattle dog became what the country demanded. Not fragile, not ornamental, not easy to exhaust. The pressure of the land wrote itself into the animal until the animal could answer the land back. And maybe that is the final reframe this breed forces on us. We often talk about dogs as if they first become useful and then become known. This one shows the reverse. It was useful in the oldest sense before it was ever fully understood in the formal one. It carried the memory of work in its frame, and the work kept refining the memory. That is why the Australian cattle dog still feels less like a product than a lesson. Survival can shape beauty, labor can shape identity, and a breed can become a living archive of the conditions that made it necessary. So when people see a blue heeler now, they are not just seeing a working dog. They are seeing an answer that came from heat, distance, and stubborn human need. They are seeing a design tested by reality until only the useful remained. And that is what gives this breed its quiet force. It does not ask to be admired first. It asks to be understood, because understanding it means understanding how much a life can be rewritten by the world that refuses to make room for weakness. The Australian cattle dog is a living, breathing history of survival, but I want to hear from you. Have you ever owned a heeler, or have you seen that selective obedience firsthand? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to see more deep dives into the secrets behind our favorite breeds, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. See you in the next one.